When a game releases on multiple platforms, you hope that the game experience more or less is the same across the board, but that's not always the case. Over the years, there's been different versions of games released on different platforms, and there's been ports of games that end up being really janky. It's weird, and we're gonna talk about it. Ready, set, go. All right, we obviously can't make this video if we don't talk about Call of Duty to some extent. Now, the biggest, most frequently talked about issue when it comes to like bad ports of Call of Duty was originally Black Ops 3 releasing on the Xbox 360 and PS3 well into the life of the Xbox One and PS4. This is the one everyone talks about when it comes to bad ports or versions of the game. And honestly, I get it. Visually speaking, the game doesn't look that good. Also, it doesn't have a campaign. They were just like, we don't have time for this. Here's multiplayer. Enjoy. It does have zombies, though zombies like works differently in some mechanics, like compared to the other version. It's just an overall worse experience of the game. And people were critical of Activision for releasing Black Ops 3 in a way where they obviously had to like really scale back how the game looked and what features were in it just to get the game out there so that they could print a little bit more money. But Call of Duty's been doing this stuff for a while. Like, it wasn't really that new for them to like throw a lower quality version of a Call of Duty game on another console. The Nintendo Wii had a bunch of Call of Duties released on it, and some of them are a little goofy to look at. Modern Warfare 3 is always the go-to example I like to see, just because the first level, which is like such a big cinematic moment in the campaign, just looks like a completely different experience on the Nintendo Wii. Call of Duty World at War had a Nintendo Wii version that didn't even have zombies mode, which was a huge disappointment because zombies was awesome. Also, Call of Duty World at War released on the PlayStation 2 under the tagline Final Fronts. The campaign shared some of the voice acting from the main game and a couple characters, but the story is completely different. It's not even World at War, honestly. It's just a different World War II themed game that also released on the PlayStation 2. I mean, I guess back in 2008, there was still a big enough PlayStation 2 audience where they were like, hey, we can make our money back on this. Black Ops 2 and Call of Duty Ghosts did release on the Nintendo Wii U, a console that died pretty quickly, but this one's not like as noticeably bad because at the very least, the Wii U was like able to kind of compete with Xbox 360 and PS3 games at that time, so they're able to keep up mostly, but sales weren't good enough to keep warranting that. And as the new generation would come out midway through the Wii U's life, it didn't seem to like warrant, I guess, them even making a Black Ops 3 port for the Wii U. And we didn't even get to talk about all of the old DS games that were around. Pretty much for a few years, every time a Call of Duty game would release, a DS version would also come out, and it was completely different from the main game, but they tried to like thematically keep it in the same tone. It's a wild experience. I did play a little bit of a few of them. I think Modern Warfare 2, or maybe it was COD 4, and World at War I did play, and they weren't really fun. I don't know, like maybe if this is all you had, you'd be like, all right, well, I mean, this is what I got. This is Call of Duty. And some of the later ones did have zombies, which is something that, you know, the Wii version of World at War didn't have, but it wasn't like the definitive way to play Call of Duty, that's for sure. And then, of course, more recently, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 has been coming under a little bit of fire, mostly because they released it on last generation consoles, and the PlayStation 4 version looks really scuffed. I mean, I don't know what is going on here. I mean, sure, there's PS4 players out there still. They gotta get them in, but at what cost? Oh my god. All right, you know how it is when you're hunting for retro games. You scroll through listings, check photos, and just hope the games are actually in good shape, but what if you could actually see the game running before you buy it? That's exactly what Encore does. Imagine this. TikTok and like online auction sites had a baby. You can just swipe through video listings, see the actual game in action, and if something catches your eye, boom, you can just bid on it right there. And let me tell you, these auctions sometimes get wild. People throwing in last minute bids, the chat going nuts. It's like a battle for the best deal on rare games. If you've ever lost out on a game in the final seconds, you might know that pain, but here, at least you can talk some trash in the chat while it's happening. It's hilarious. Also, and this is important, Encore actually makes sure that sellers are legit. They're ID verified, and if something shows up not as described, you're covered. Plus, a lot of sellers are collectors themselves, so don't be surprised if they personally message you after you win to say thanks. Oh, and before I forget, there are free giveaways on the app all the time. Just to enter, and if you want to win, Encore even covers the shipping. You can even get extra entries just by sharing with friends. So yeah, it's totally worth checking out. If you're into retro games or just just love the thrill of a good auction, you gotta check out Encore. It's free to download, easy to use, and packed with awesome deals and giveaways. Use our link in the description to get started and see what you can find. And before we get into more games, there's one more Call of Duty game that was kind of weird. Black Ops Declassified, coming out around the time of Call of Duty Black Ops 2. Instead of just making a port of Black Ops 2 for the PS Vita, they were like, hey, let's make a multiplayer partial port reusing Black Ops 1 stuff for the PS Vita and do like a Spec Ops type thing that uses the multiplayer maps. It's a weird thing. Not quite exactly like a port per se or a version of a game. It's like a spin-off technically, but man, what was this? When it came to Sonic the Hedgehog, the PlayStation 2 didn't really get a whole lot of Sonic stuff. Like for instance, it got neither of the Sonic Adventure games, which did go to GameCube. It did get Sonic Heroes, and I mean, that was a W because it wasn't as bad as the Xbox version of Sonic Heroes, which ran absolutely terribly. Like, oh my god. And then they got Shadow the Hedgehog, you know, the emo, edgy spinoff. But then things get weird when we're looking at the mainline Sonic games. Sonic 06 released on the Xbox 360 and PS3, so sorry PS2 players, you're out of luck. Sonic and the Secret Rings released on the Wii, but Sonic Unleashed, oh baby, it's coming back to the PS2. Sonic Unleashed is an interesting game. So it was like a main Sonic game. It was developed for a couple more months than Sonic 06 at least. Sonic turns into a werehog. But while Sonic 06's development made it where it would be too hard to get Sonic 06 working on the Wii, so they forked it and did a whole Sonic and the Secret Rings thing, Sonic Unleashed would have a dedicated Wii version. They were going to avoid the whole issues that they ran into before. So essentially, Sonic Unleashed would enter development on two separate engines, one being made for Xbox 360 and PS3, and the other being made for the Wii. Now, just to be clear, Sonic Unleashed on the Wii, it could have been the same exact engine as the Xbox 360 and PS3 version. I couldn't find like definitive answers, but it was a different build specifically for the Wii in mind. It wasn't like how the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions were like built at the same time with the intentions of it forking for those versions. This one was developed like separately during the same time, simultaneously. But here's the thing that's interesting is that the game has the same story. It has the same like location. The concept of having like werehog levels and running levels are there the same. However, the level designs are actually different, and just some things about the actual levels and gameplay are different as well. Also, some of the cutscenes are altered, not necessarily like the 3D pre-rendered ones, but the like smaller like ones that could have been done in engine so that they could run on the Wii. But at the same time, they were like, hey, you know what? We have this Wii version. Let's go ahead and make a PS2 version based on the Wii version. So then we have like another downgrade of the first of all like lower quality downgrade that was already being developed. It's not that interesting of a downgrade really. It's just there's like worse graphics on the PS2 version compared to the Wii version. Sound quality's also not the best, but it's just an interesting instance because we were like, okay, we have Sonic Unleashed for the Xbox 360 and the PS3. Then there's the downgraded version, which is for the Wii, which, you know, has some technical changes so that the game still like works and feels like a similar experience, even though it's not the same experience. And then we have this PS2 bastard child. Have at it, PS2 fans. And that was Sonic Unleashed. What an interesting time. Now, when it comes to games that have really bad ports across the board, there's definitely a lot, but we wanted to focus more on the ones that have like a really, really unique story or some interesting angle to it. Batman Arkham Knight is one that's often brought up when it comes to PC versions of games being not good. Released in summer of 2015, the PC version was kind of a joke. Like, it had some of the worst game optimization ever. There were frame rate drops, crashes, there was a lot of stuttering. Even if you had like the best PC, the game would not work right. There was a lot of backlash when this happened, and Warner Bros. Actually ended up choosing to delist the game from Steam and work on some fixes, and they eventually would re-release the game in October of 2015 with some fixes. But man, the reputation was a bit rough. There are other examples of this specific scenario where especially PC players getting a worse version of something that console players had. It's kind of weird how that dynamic was really common in the older days of gaming where PC players would be left out to just have like some weird jank version of a game. Things have kind of shifted since then. Sometimes the PC version of a game is better and the console versions are the worst versions, but nonetheless, the Batman Arkham Knight story is just one that like we couldn't at least touch on, even if we're not going to go into every single time there was like a bad port for frame rate issues or just like, you know, bad optimization. But yeah, Batman Arkham Knight, whew.
Initially, when starting to put together this topic, the first game that came to my mind was Mortal Kombat 1 for the Nintendo Switch. Do you guys remember how bad that game looked and how bad it was compared to the other versions for like Xbox Series X, PS5 and PC? It was just one of the worst graphical downgrades we've seen and probably one of the most recent examples we're gonna have on this list, because this game came out less than 2 years ago. Now the Switch has never been the most powerful console, and me and Elijah will actually talk about that a little bit later on in the video, but damn, Mortal Kombat 1 for the Nintendo Switch was just rough. Besides the obviously noticeable graphical downgrades, there was also a ton of performance issues and missing content, going as far as some fatality effects and stuff not being in the Switch version. And honestly, the more you think about it, the worse it gets, because this was also a $70 game. Yes, these two versions I'm showing you side by side were the same price tag. One looks like a modern Mortal Kombat game, and the other one looks like someone demade Mortal Kombat 1 for the N64. And while the developer acknowledged some of the issues and did some patches to fix some stuff, there's still a lot of performance issues as far as I can tell from doing some research on the patches. And obviously the horrendous visual downgrade is not something they can, update with patches as easily. So the game still looks the same. It just runs slightly better.
You guys remember the console, the 3DO? Yeah, me neither. But there was a port of Doom for the 3DO that was officially sanctioned in 1996. Essentially, the company Art Data Interactive purchased the console rights to Doom, but they didn't have a team that would actually be able to do a 3DO port, so they shopped around some studios and they found a lady known as Rebecca Heinemann, who worked at Logicware, to work on a port. She apparently had made the Wolfenstein 3DO port, so they were like, oh, this person can do it well. Heinemann accepted the job under the impression that, they were well on their way with the project and just needed someone to come in and clean it up and optimize stuff. But as it turned out, nothing had actually been done yet. Matter of fact, prior to taking the job, Heinemann was under the impression that there was new levels in the game and new enemies and weapons. The CEO who had talked to her, hyped it up. This was the definitive coolest version of Doom ever. Still, you got to get the bag. You got to finish your job and do whatever it takes to, fulfill the requirements of your contract when you take the job. So Heinemann ended up reaching out directly to id Software and was like, hey, I have nothing and I don't know how I'm supposed to port this. And id Software was like, hey, here's the source files. Maybe that'll help. And Heinemann had 10 weeks to just put something together with no support from the actual company. So, kudos to Heinemann for getting it out the door, I guess. But the Doom 3DO version is very interesting because it is probably the worst version of Doom. It's impressive that this game was able to even exist and release and get flipped around in 10 weeks. From a technical standpoint, wow. From a consumer standpoint, yikes. So the 3DO had this weird issue where it couldn't transfer audio that was set for the Atari Jaguar. The drivers weren't able to be ported regularly or correctly. So Heinemann went to the, Art Data, the company that hired her, and was like, hey, what do we do about music? And the CEO was like, don't worry, I'm a part of a band. Wait, what? So here's the wildest part of the whole Doom 3DO journey. The music that the CEO and his band recorded to replace the actual Doom soundtrack actually was kind of good. Okay, listen to the Atari Jaguar version. And then this is what they replaced it with, recorded by the CEO's band. This is in a way technologically impressive. They had a better sounding recording at least. This is the precursor to what they actually did when Doom 2016 would roll around. But it just opens up a bigger can of worms here for the whole Doom 3DO thing. First of all, how were they here's 10 weeks to put this port together, but also in this 10 weeks, we will have no problem getting the band together to record the entirety of the Doom soundtrack? I don't know. This is one of the rarer pieces of Doom history that's never really talked about, but yeah, Doom for the 3DO has its own unique soundtrack, unlike any of the other ports of Doom, making it one of the weirdest versions of the game, by far. So the CEO and his band recorded a bunch of remixes of the original soundtrack and was like, put these in, which Heinemann did. So the main issue of the game was the fact that since it was coming off of the Atari Jaguar version, the fork with the source code and all that, it just wasn't optimized. It didn't have time to be optimized for the 3DO. So it had really low low frame rates, and it had to run on like a really low resolution. So like you had a small screen. I guess there were like cheat codes where you could like make the screen larger, but it would make the game run slower. And the game already had a bunch of performance issues with the lower resolutions, so that wasn't good. Also, as it turns out, the reason that they hid the little cheat code to make the screen bigger was that they're hoping that the follow-up sequel system to the 3DO, the Panasonic M2, would have like a faster processor, and thus, you know, the game would be able to be ported over to the next console and maybe run better. But you know, the M2 got canceled, so who knows? Doom is a wild game if you like look into the lore about development between various versions of these games.
Skyrim gets memed on a lot for releasing on a ton of platforms, and even Bethesda themselves memed that it's gonna come to the smart fridge. And I think Skyrim is even on Alexa. But a game that had even more releases on different platforms was Resident Evil 4. Originally, it started out as a GameCube exclusive in 2005, but within the same year releasing on PlayStation 2, which this version itself, the PS2 version of Resident Evil 4, people already consider the worst version at this point because the GameCube version was much better. The PS2 version just looked and played a lot worse. And sadly, this version was used as the porting point when the game came to PC in 2007. Now from there, they would go on to re-release Resident Evil 4 a lot more. There was a Wii version in 2007, it came to iOS in 2009. Then once the new generation rolled around in 2011, Resident Evil 4 also came to the PS3 and 360. Then an Android version was released in 2013. Then PlayStation 4, Xbox One got it, Nintendo Switch got it. And then more recently, we got a version for the Oculus Quest 2, which is technically the latest Resident Evil 4 re-release besides the remake, obviously, but the remake kind of stands separate from all of this. But there's one Resident Evil 4 re-release I intentionally skipped because, you know, I want to go more in depth about it. But in 2009, Resident Evil 4 released on the Zeebo. Now you might be wondering, what the is a Zeebo? Well, the Zeebo was a Brazilian home console that released in Brazil and Mexico in 2009, and it was kind of trying to be an affordable home console, being priced at $500 in Brazilian currency. What is BLR? Wait a minute. I guess Brazilian real? That's what their currency is called. So it's 500 Brazilian real, which is like $86 today in US dollars. And this console also had the gimmick of there being no discs. Instead, you would download the games over 3G internet. The Zeebo did not get a lot of games, and there's only like a short list of games that actually released. Most notably, I guess, FIFA 09 and Crash Bandicoot Nitro Kart 3D, and then obviously Resident Evil 4. Obviously, with a console this cheap, you know, the hardware wasn't very strong, and a lot of people compared it to like PS1 and 64 levels of graphics at the time, while the PlayStation 3 and the 360 were dominating the market at that point. And the console itself might have been cheap, but the games were still kind of pricey, so people still couldn't afford a lot of games to play on the Zeebo. And also, Android phones were stronger than the Zeebo at the time already, so I don't know, this console just kind of seemed like a failure in the making. But what's interesting about the Zeebo version of Resident Evil 4 is that this is just the iOS port ported to the Zeebo. With this just being a mobile-based port, it obviously had extremely low resolution textures, the environments were simplified by a lot, and the lighting just looked completely different than the other Resident Evil versions. Plus, the performance itself with the frame rate and the animations was even worse than the iOS version itself, making it so that aiming and moving around was just kind of frustrating and not fun at all. This version also had only 12 missions, which I think the original Resident Evil 4 had 16 missions, so they must have cut out some content, but it was really hard for me to find out which ones specifically, since there's just not a lot of documentation on this game. So if someone actually played this back in the day, first of all, I'm sorry, this is how you experience Resident Evil 4, but also maybe you can answer the question about the content being cut, because the campaign potentially being shorter is not the only thing. They also cut out all the mercenary missions and, you know, all that stuff. Also, real quick, Resident Evil 2 originally had also a pretty good re-release on a obscure console called the Game.com, made by Tiger Electronics, which converted the whole game, which was a 3D like game at the time, into this game that was mostly sprites, but also like there was like depth and 3D to it. I don't know, it's a really bizarre thing to look at, but it also obviously was the worst way to experience Resident Evil 2. And I could get into the whole Tiger Electronics thing and the Game.com console, but honestly, maybe we'll save that for another video because I already talked about the Zeebo a bunch. There was one more recent Resident Evil port that was kind of weird, since with Resident Evil Revelations 2, the PS Vita also got a version. This was obviously a downgrade in performance and graphics, and the co-op mode was cut. It was just overall a worse version of the game. Now, what's interesting is that this goes as far as the button layout also being messed up because the PS Vita doesn't have L2 and R2 buttons, like the triggers at the bottom, right? It just has the bumpers at the top. So the way the game played was also worse. And then I looked into the studio that did this a little bit, and they're mostly known for mobile ports and web games and stuff like that. So I don't know, it's kind of a weird choice. Definitely not a good port.
Let's talk about Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut for the Nintendo GameCube. Now, interestingly enough, this was a really big title for the Sega Dreamcast, and nowadays, in general, Sonic has kind of the reputation of not being the most polished game series, especially in the 3D realm of games. Matter of fact, Sonic Adventure in general doesn't have the best reputation. However, a lot of people don't realize that the GameCube version, which came out a couple of years after the original launch of Sonic Adventure for the Sega Dreamcast, was essentially just not the best port. Don't get me wrong, I loved Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut for the Nintendo GameCube. I loved it as a kid. It was my first main Sonic Adventure game, and then I played Sonic Adventure 2 afterwards. It was cool, but there were bugs. I mean, it wasn't uncommon to go flying off the map and dying to something that really wasn't your fault, like you clipped through something. It wouldn't be until years later that it came to light that it was actually a problem with the port, and that if you played Sonic Adventure on the Dreamcast the way that the game originally was intended, the game was surprisingly competent, and a lot of the issues that would carry over into the GameCube version weren't necessarily there across the board. But things get even weirder when you look at Sonic Adventure, because a couple of years after the Dreamcast release and after the GameCube release, they actually ported Director's Cut over to the PC, and this would become the definitive version to play if you wanted the worst experience. This game was of course based off of the GameCube version of the game, though there were a couple of things occasionally taken from the original Dreamcast version, reverted back, and in general, the port wasn't the best. It was even less polished than the GameCube version. There were quite a few issues with lighting, different things would just look weird or off. Look at this lava. It looks less lava-y. And because of the differences in the way that lighting mechanics and engines are used in the PC version of the game, sometimes the characters look almost like rubber in some instances compared to what they would look like on the other console versions. Also, some of the sound is lower quality. Listen to this.
I am Dr. Robotnik, the greatest scientific genius in the world.
Whatever you say, Eggman.
I am Dr. Robotnik, the greatest scientific genius in the world.
Whatever you say, Eggman.
So yeah, there's just a few oddities to this version of the game, making it an even worse port than what some people considered to be the worst port of Sonic Adventure Director's Cut.
I wasn't quite sure if Minecraft for the new 3DS counted on this list because it's not necessarily a bad game. It's just that all the other versions of Minecraft are much better. This version released for the new 3DS in 2017 exclusively on the eShop, even though I think there is some level of physical release, at least in the US, which I think was the only country that got a physical version of this. But yeah, this was just a heavily modified version of the Pocket Edition, which was a version of Minecraft that was made for weaker phones, so it already was a weaker version itself. I think I bought the Pocket Edition back in the day on my iPod Touch and I would play it at school. It already was kind of a weird version I always preferred when I got home and I was able to play Minecraft on my computer. Anyways, I'm getting off track. This version was kind of limited with the frame rate that it could hit, and also there was a limit on the worlds and how large they can be, I think, which might have been something that just came with the Pocket Edition. I'm not sure, I don't remember anymore. Also, post-launch support just wasn't there. Minecraft lives off its updates, and this new 3DS version was only supported for a year and a half, or not even a year and a half. I think it was just roughly 16 months before the last update came out, and the Minecraft version for the new Nintendo 3DS was abandoned, making it one of the most short-lived Minecraft versions out there. Now, if you had this as a kid and this was your only way to enjoy Minecraft, I'm sure you had a great time, and I mean, I think for a Minecraft port on a 3DS, it's not the worst thing ever, but it definitely is a weaker version of the overall Minecraft experience, especially looking back to it nowadays with, the Switch version being out and all these other things.
Okay, let's talk about James Bond for a second. If you guys didn't know, we did a deep dive on every single James Bond game that's ever released, but it was interesting to take a closer look at these two games, The World Is Not Enough and The World Is Not Enough. If you can tell by the box arts here, one of these is the Nintendo 64 version and the other is the PlayStation version. Both games released the same year, just about a month apart. Both were published by Electronic Arts. Neither were developed by the same team. Just completely different games based on the same movie. Now, the historical context is pretty wild here. After developer Rare had a runaway success with GoldenEye, MGM, who had the rights to James Bond, was like, all right, which publisher wants to, give us the best deal to continue making Bond games? Rare didn't have that EA money, so they were outbid and they'd go on to make Perfect Dark. And EA was like, hey, we'll do it. Why not? Now, there wasn't enough time to do a full-fledged Bond game, so they kind of spun out and made a Tomorrow Never Dies adventure action type game for the PlayStation 1. But The World Is Not Enough was supposed to be like the definitive first-person shooter experience that would be the follow-up to Rare's GoldenEye, but with like a whole nother team working on the game. Meanwhile, Eurocom had been working on a new engine, and EA was impressed, so they're like, hey, go ahead, let's make the game movie here. But at the same time, it would be easier and less expensive to have the team that did Tomorrow Never Dies for the PlayStation also make a game. So like EA was like, hey, we'll just make 2 games, and we'll just put the same box art on it, call it the same thing, and just see what happens. YOLO. Now, to be fair, the Nintendo 64 version of The World Is Not Enough isn't nearly as good as GoldenEye was back in the day, but it still was neat. Like, it was a competent first-person shooter at the end of the N64's life. It had interesting campaign aspects to it, and a multiplayer that still was pretty fun. There were some gadgets I remember that were kind of cool when I rented this game from Blockbuster as like a kid. But the PlayStation version was a little bit weirder, especially if you played both of the games back in the day, which I did as a kid because I rented the game for the N64 and then later would rent the game for the PlayStation when we did get a PlayStation. And I was like, these games aren't the same game. The gameplay is completely different. These rooms in the first level are not the same. The PlayStation version definitely was the worst version of the game, and they were using that third-person engine that they had for the previous game, but they forced it into a first-person perspective for this time around. There were some serious frame rate issues here. There was some interesting motion capture that was pretty innovative for the time. Wikipedia says that they got Keanu Reeves' stunt double from The Matrix, which, neat. But this game didn't even have multiplayer. The thing that made GoldenEye so massively popular was its split-screen multiplayer, and the PlayStation version just wasn't going to have that for whatever reason. And mind you, this game came out at a time where Medal of Honor had already kind of came out, so what first-person shooter would you rather play? It wasn't a bad game, but it just was the worst game and just a weird case study, I guess, on 2 games being published by the same company by different studios that are the same game. Same name of a game? I'm losing myself on this one. Now, when it comes to the Bond series, there are a few other interesting examples of similar things happening, maybe not quite to the full scale. Nightfire, my favorite Bond game probably ever. Maybe GoldenEye still over that, but a game that felt really good as a Bond game, super underrated game, had a bit of a wacky PC port. It wasn't just a port of the console version. It essentially was a rebuild of the game in a modified version of the Half-Life engine. This version is just notoriously worse than the console versions of the game, and this kind of opens up the discussion for a lot of licensed games. If you were a gamer in the mid to late 2000s, I'm sure you saw a ton of licensed games that were most of the time really low quality, and that was the standard. Every once in a while there'd be a good licensed game that would come around, but these licensed games would always release on so many different consoles, and there would be version differences across the board, especially when there was some Disney Pixar movie getting a game movie, and then they would do a DS version or something like that. The DS version obviously would be a completely different build than the console version. That makes sense, but that was something really commonplace. I felt like we had to touch on it slightly if we were going to make this topic of a video, because that was such a big time of the port era.
2012 was an interesting year for gaming overall. There was a bunch of really good games that came out that year. We got Mass Effect 3, we got Far Cry 3, we got Dishonored, we got Assassin's Creed 3, Max Payne 3 also came out. Plus, also Borderlands 2 released in 2012, which probably was the co-op game of the year. Now, another thing that happened in 2012 was the PlayStation Vita releasing, at least over here in the West, and that console was off to a rough start. Within a year, major publishers like EA, Ubisoft, or Activision stopped making games for the console because of low sales. Sony themselves never put franchises like God of War, Gran Turismo, or Infamous, or whatever they had at the time, on the PlayStation Vita, which is something they would do with the PlayStation Portable years ago. And even by E3 2014, Sony themselves barely mentioned the PlayStation Vita at their own showcase. So within 2-3 years, it was pretty clear the PlayStation Vita was gonna be a failure. Now, I was a big PlayStation Portable enjoyer, and so I did pick up the Vita, and I did play a bunch of games, starting from 2012 onwards. And while I personally had some fun times with the Vita, and there was some interesting little games on there was also some really bad ports that were held back by the Vita's hardware limitations. In my opinion, opinion, the most notorious one was Borderlands 2 for the PlayStation Vita, which released in 2014, 2 years after the original Borderlands 2 release. This game struggled to maintain 20 FPS and, often dipping even below that, which you can clearly see from the footage. It's hard to aim, it's hard to walk around, it's hard to even talk to NPCs and stuff. And forget about it when there's some intense combat sequence or even an explosion, because the frame rate is just gonna fall off a cliff. And obviously, because of the PlayStation Vita, they also had to downgrade the graphics and the visual clarity, which does not help at all when, the game is already stuttering along, that you're also not able to see as much detail from the get-go. There was this weird popping going on with the enemies because the render distance was also low. It was just kind of a mess of a port. Plus, the NPCs themselves, or the AI, was just dumbed down because I guess the Vita couldn't calculate that much, or I don't know how that works, but that's what I assume. So the game overall just kind of felt like a way worse version than Borderlands 2 on any other platform. Now, if you ever played Borderlands 2, what made Borderlands 2 special was a 4-player co-op. It was really fun to hop on with 3 other friends and, play through this massive campaign. It is actually a really good co-op game. One of the very few games that naturally feels like a 4-player co-op game. Now, the PlayStation Vita version cut that down to only 2 players being able to play, which could be due to the hardware not being able to handle 4 players at a time, but I like to believe that they just knew you weren't gonna find 3 friends that own a PlayStation Vita. Now, this port was outsourced by Gearbox and not developed by them. It was developed by Iron Galaxy Studios, who have a long track record of making all sorts of ports and stuff, and they're also the ones that made the Batman Arkham Knight port for the PC, which we talked about earlier. So it kind of comes full circle here. Also, Borderlands 2 obviously had a lot of DLC, and some of the DLC actually never made it to the PlayStation Vita, even though the Borderlands 2 Game of the Year edition with all DLC already came out the year prior to this. Overall, this is just the worst version of Borderlands 2 you can play, which, is a great game if you play it on anywhere else besides the Vita.
In our last video, we talked about a game that was kind of a spin-off, but also a port. It's a weird mix of it. Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop for the Wii. It came out like a year and a half after the first Dead Rising game came out. That was just a wild game experience. It had a lot of things cut out of the game, but more interestingly, it reused assets from Resident Evil 4 for the Wii. I don't know how this happened. I guess it was utilizing the same engine and they didn't want to port all the guns and weapons over. So they were just like, you know what, whatever, just throw them in there and call it a day. We already talked about this game not too long ago, so I don't want to talk about it for forever, but Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop, the notably worse version of Dead Rising 1 for those Wii kids out there. Ayo, I see you.
Also, I think something we didn't really mention in the last section we did on this game is that there was way less zombies, which I feel like the appeal of Dead Rising on the 360 was that there was hordes of zombies you can mow through, but on the Wii version, they were limited.
They didn't have the resources. The Wii couldn't handle too many zombies at a time, so they had to chop them till you drop them, you know what I mean? The frame rates.
So back in the day, I was a big Game Boy Advance enjoyer, very big Game Boy Advance enjoyer, That was my main console. I would play it every day. Every chance I had, I would pull out my Game Boy Advance. But one game I came across was Need for Speed Underground for the Game Boy Advance, and I actually did have that game for the PlayStation as well, and playing the Game Boy version was one of the worst experiences I've ever had at that time. It just looked awful, it ran awful, and it just played awful. I didn't think it was a very good port for how great of a game Need for Speed Underground is, and they did make a sequel with Underground 2, which also got a Game Boy port, which I didn't play that one, but I could not imagine it's very much better. There was some interesting things about it, instead of doing the sprite thing, which other Game Boy racing games would do, they did a 3D engine, but I think it just made the game look worse because it was a 3D engine trying to render on the Game Boy, which didn't look very good because it's a Game Boy. That was one of the earliest memories of a game kind of having a worse version that I can remember, from my childhood.
I have a similar instance with Driver 2. It originally came out on, I think, PlayStation 1. I think I remember there being multiple discs to that game. And then eventually they released a Game Boy Advance version, which, to be fair, for a Game Boy Advance game, the fact that you had a 3D driving game where you could actually get out of the car and steal other people's cars, that's advanced 3D tech for a Game Boy Advance. But then when you look at the graphics of the game, It's something. I had fun with the game. It definitely isn't the optimal experience to play Driver 2, though. Halo 2 for Windows Vista. What a crazy experience this game is. First of all, Halo 2 released on Xbox in 2004. The Vista port released in 2007, the same year that Halo 3 would release on Xbox 360. And essentially, Halo 2 Vista, in every way possible, was the worst version of the game, despite the fact that it was finally on the PC. Now, what made Halo 2 Vista even worse, though, was that Combat Evolved was a very popular PC game. Like the first Halo game, you know, it had like custom like maps and game types and servers that people played. Halo 2 Vista was rough. Like it had the whole like Windows Live thing going on with it. The game sometimes just like didn't work properly. The multiplayer balancing was all over the place. And just a lot of aspects of the game had like various inconsistencies with the Xbox version of the game. The source material, of course, it wasn't the same studio, was developed by Hired Gun. The weirder thing, though, is that Halo 2 Vista notoriously wasn't like, you know, the best form of Halo 2 by far, easily. Like that wasn't really up for debate. There were fan mods that would later come and make it more acceptable or whatever. But when it came time for 343 Industries to remake Halo 2 for the Master Chief Collection, and they do the whole anniversary graphics, they opted into using the Vista version of the game because it was easier because it was already on the PC, and that version was just infinitely worse. So there was a lot of like inconsistencies with that version that like came out of the gate. So when MCC launched, their Halo 2 that they had used for the version of the thing was like dramatically incorrect compared to the original Halo 2, and then there's the anniversary graphics. So essentially, while over time Halo 2 did get fixed up quite a bit in MCC, they had to go and fix a lot of the issues that were the original Vista port issues that like weren't even considered when they decided to do the port in the first place. It's weird. Like they double dipped in an issue that they could have easily avoided, but I digress. I just don't know why. Now, there's always a lot of criticism when it comes to Nintendo Switch as a console, mostly due to its like actual performance capabilities. Now, Nintendo Switch is old now. Like it came out in 2017 and it's 2025 and we're finally getting word about the Switch 2. But with that being said, then obviously the Nintendo Switch doesn't have the same power capabilities as a computer or an Xbox Series X or something like that. But it is really impressive what the Switch can do. Like The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, a great example of a modern game that still runs really well and is impressive, you know, for making the capabilities of the Switch be utilized to the best of its abilities. But sometimes other games make their way onto the Switch where it's a pretty big downgrade. It's not the best looking thing. And interestingly enough, Fortnite is probably the weirdest game on the Switch. Like, obviously Fortnite's a really popular game, but Fortnite on the Nintendo Switch, I want to say, is probably the worst way you could experience Fortnite in today's ecosystem. If you like watch performance plays of Fortnite, or you just try Fortnite on Nintendo Switch, it's a pretty big downgrade. Visually speaking, it's not good. A lot of the character models take a really long time to load in. It's weird. The performance isn't the best. And it's interesting that we live in this era where mobile phones have gotten so powerful, especially through the Nintendo Switch's life, where you'll probably have a better experience playing Fortnite on like an Android phone, or if you could figure out how to play it on an iPhone, or even through the cloud, than you would actually playing on a Nintendo Switch. Now, I do think when the Switch 2 gets released, Fortnite will get a big upgrade and it'll look a lot better, but I'm surprised that Fortnite has managed to survive on the Switch, barely, with the performance that it does have. Fortnite isn't the only game that this fits into. There's a lot of other games out there. A notable one, Overwatch 2. Like, imagine playing Overwatch 2 on a Nintendo Switch. It has to be like the most insane experience that exists out there. Competitive FPS game that is like compressed down to be able to perform on a Nintendo Switch. It's an insane concept to begin with. There's a lot of other games I was surprised had a Nintendo Switch release. The Outer Worlds is on the Switch, surprisingly. It's playable. You can play the game, but when you start looking at the graphics side by side from like a PC version and the Nintendo Switch version, it's almost comically worse. I mean, I get they're trying to make it work. They're trying to just let you have the experience on the go. But it is interesting to see that the reason that there's this discussion about like, is the Nintendo Switch going to be powerful enough to run a certain game, or is the Switch 2 going to be, you know, a big upgrade, is because a lot of these third-party games are seeing significant downgrades, especially now with how old the Switch is. It's cool that these games release there, but they're definitely like the weirdest, lowest quality version.
They also release these games at full price often, right? At like worse versions of old games even. Especially, I was thinking like Assassin's Creed 3 had major performance issues, even though it's like an old game. Like, when did Assassin's Creed 3 come out? Like early 2010s. And somehow the Switch port is like really bad. Like it can barely run at like 20 FPS consistently when you get to like the bigger environments, even though it's like 5 or more years older than the console itself. And then they're charging like a good price tag for that.
Also, I just think it's wild that the Nintendo Switch has a version of Ark, like that survival game. That's another insane multiplayer game to be trying to play on your Nintendo Switch. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but that's insane. Also, remember how years ago now, Genshin Impact, that mobile game, was announced for the Nintendo Switch. Where is it? Still not here. We got the announcement trailer and literally nothing else ever again. And how many years has it been since then? I looked it up. It was 5 years ago. They announced the Nintendo Switch port of Genshin Impact. Still not here. Still no word on it. No official cancellation. But Xbox eventually got it, and it wasn't even ever announced for the Xbox until way later. The main reason Genshin Impact never came to Nintendo Switch is the fact that they didn't want to do the Fortnite Overwatch 2 route of having a substantially downgraded version from what you would get on like a mobile phone just to get the game to run, because it is a pretty expansive game. I mean, if you think about it, a Nintendo Switch is what, like $300? And a mobile phone usually costs $1,000. It makes sense why the technology is different. You're getting a console for $300, but at the same time, psychologically, it's still weird that a console is, sometimes struggling to keep up with phones nowadays. It'll be interesting to see more games come, because I think more third-party developers are like down for the Switch. Like, we know Xbox has said that they want to bring Call of Duty to the Nintendo Switch. They're probably waiting until the next Switch comes out to do that. We don't want to have another, Black Ops 6 PS4 debacle on their hands, I'm sure. But
dude, imagine we had Black Ops 6 on the Switch. That would be insane, dude.
I would main that. Rainbow Six Siege on the Switch, dude.
Dude, we can hope that we get maybe Siege Mobile on the Switch, I guess.
Nah. Siege Mobile is never coming out. I don't believe it exists. I think the only reason they announced the little thing with the Joy-Cons, the mouse thing, is just strictly for Rainbow Six Siege players.
You're right. Actually, they're gonna
a built-in simming.
Built-in simming. That actually, I didn't think about it, but that's actually a good point.
You have one controller as a mouse, and then the other one is like your walking stick and your aiming stick.
What was the game I played like the Crossfire X, dude?
I remember that. You had the controller in one hand and your mouse in the other?
No, I aimed with the controller and I walked with the keyboard actually because it didn't work like in the beta. So I was actually voice scuffed.
I miss Crossfire X. I hope it comes back one day. It won't.
It won't. Do you remember there was a bunch of issues with the PS3 version of Skyrim as well? It was like the longer you played the game, the worse it ran or something. There was like some memory leak issue. I don't really remember all the details, so
I think I remember that too. I think in general, when it came to Bethesda releasing RPGs, the PlayStation 3 versions just had extra trouble, like more issues than the Xbox 360 version, whether it was like soft locking or hard locking and save issues as well. So it doesn't really surprise me to hear that Skyrim for the PS3 was the worst version of the game to play, but I'm pretty sure like some of the Fallout games also had some issues as well, just like on the PlayStation 3. Also, PlayStation 3 in general, when it came down to Xbox 360 and PS3 performance, just some of the time the PS3 would have extra issues with the game when it launched. The orange box, when that came to Xbox 360 and PS3 version was known for being the worser of the two. Worse of the two. There was just like a lot of performance issues. The Xbox version was just at least functional, and the PS3 version was not that. Team Fortress 2 apparently was like really messed up on the PS3, so that was just a wild time as well. So yeah, the PS3 like did have like strong hardware in it, and it could perform really well, but I think it was just a lot harder for third-party developers to figure out like what the differences were when programming things for the Xbox 360 and PS3, and sometimes things were overlooked, and the PS3 versions would suffer because of it.
If you were a gamer in 2014, there was the 3 big consoles that games would release on: the Xbox One, the PS4, and the Wii U. And usually, much like with the Switch versions we talked about, the Wii U versions were the worst versions of these mainline games. We had like some Call of Duty games we talked about earlier on the Wii U and stuff like that. But another game that I remember being reviewed very badly was Watch Dogs for the Wii U. It just seemed like the Wii U was not able to handle an open world GTA style game like Watch Dogs. And obviously the resolution was lowered, the textures were lowered, the NPC count was lowered. It just seemed like the whole game was just like a downgrade. Now, the Wii U version essentially was abandoned after launch. They never got any patches after launch, so all the bugs stayed in. There was no DLC support. The gamepad was a afterthought. The features that you could do on the gamepad, which could have been cool. Like, Watch Dogs, you hack stuff. Maybe on the Wii U version, you could have used the gamepad to hack some stuff or like play a little mini game. They just had the map on the gamepad, as far as I know. After the poor sales of Watch Dogs on the Wii U, Ubisoft decided that they would not be making any more Wii U games, Wii U versions of their mainline games. I think we also had a couple of Assassin's Creed around the time, but I don't think they sold too well either. So I think Watch Dogs was like the final nail in the coffin for Ubisoft to drop the Wii U from their roster.
Ubisoft was banking pretty hard on the Wii U too, if I remember correctly. Like they had a Zombie U as a launch title. Like they believed. It didn't work.
Cyberpunk 2077 is one of mine and Elijah's favorite game to come out in the last couple years. We both enjoyed the game despite its flaws. We thought the atmosphere was amazing. I had fun doing the story. It was well written, in my opinion. There was interesting characters, interesting things to do. And the DLC was also kind of good. But Cyberpunk 2077 also goes down in history as one of the worst launches ever for a major game. Especially the PS4 players had it rough back in the day, which was what back in the day was like what 2022.
Didn't the game come out in 2020?
Oh, 2020. Sorry. I meant to say 2020, but somehow there was too many twos in there. Anyways, this game came out all the way back in 2020, which is 5 years ago, which is crazy. But the PS4 version was definitely the worst. There was like just insane performance issues. There was like visual downgrades on everything, basically. The textures were blurry. There was more bugs than the other versions. And, the developer themselves kind of didn't do a good job letting people know that this is not a good version.
I think CD Projekt Red kind of dropped the ball with the release of Cyberpunk 2077. We won't go too hard on them. They did end up making the game a really solid version of Cyberpunk eventually. So besides the multiple delays the game had leading right up to the release, since the game was releasing during the pandemic, they had some reviewers reviewing the game through like a cloud system. So the game would be played essentially on like an optimized system, which would give reviewers the impression that the game was more polished than it actually was. However, the game would release, which, mind you, it was originally announced as an Xbox One and PS4 game. The next-gen version was like just at that time, the next-gen consoles were coming out. Current gen was a PS4 and Xbox One. Those were dramatically worse. Now, the Xbox One version somehow managed to like operate where you could still play the game and you get some bugs and some things. But the PlayStation 4 version was notably worse, like worse off than all the other versions that were out there. And that caused a lot of outrage. I think there was like a whole delisting of the game that happened with PlayStation 4. Am I right about that, Luke?
Yeah, I think they took it off the store for a while and they were offering refunds to people who had bought it. I think even as far as like on Steam even. That's how like crazy the whole thing was. But on PlayStation for sure you could get refunds and they delisted it for a while. I don't remember how long it was delisted. It was like a lengthy time.
Interestingly enough, Luke and I were lucky enough to get Xbox Series X's around launch time. Like we managed to snag some pre-orders right in at the last minute and get Xbox Series X's. So we were able to play Cyberpunk and have like not as many issues. I mean, Cyberpunk across the board, no matter what version you were playing, was buggy and messy. It was still a good game, but it was buggy. But those Xbox One and PS4 versions were dramatically worse. But our friend Dim didn't get the Xbox Series X. He was still playing on his 2013 Xbox One, his launch console. And he was able to play Cyberpunk. It ran. He didn't have any complaints, really. So it was interesting because there was a lot of people complaining about like the older hardware just not keeping up. But Dim didn't have any problems. We also tried to play Scrabble with Dim. And
yeah, the Ubisoft Scrabble or whatever.
Yeah, we tried to play the Ubisoft Scrabble. Ubisoft Scrabble did not work on the Xbox One. It would not load. It would work on the Xbox Series X. When Luke and I tried to play it, we all wanted to play Scrabble together on the Xbox. Didn't work. But Cyberpunk worked. So I don't know. Like the Xbox One launch edition, the VCR looking thing was an enigma of a console. It's insane. Dim just showed up in our chat saying that was a crazy time. If you're watching this on our YouTube channel as like a regular video, we did our first ever live stream at right here on our channel. Thursday night, Friday night. What night? What night is it tonight? It is Friday.
It is Friday the 14th.
Friday night at 8 p.m. sharp. Don't miss it. If you guys want to stop by and watch us do our recording session for videos like this. Also on Twitch. If you are a Twitch user, you can watch us on there too.
Yeah,
that's it. That's the whole plug. We'll continue talking about games now.
Did you ever play Gex entered the Gecko.
Is that the N64 one?
Well, I think it is one that also released on the N64, but I saw someone say like that the N64 version was the worst version because the render distance and stuff was like worse. I think it released on the PlayStation. You know, I don't know where I read this, but someone said like it was like you were playing Gex and Silent Hill because the render distance was so like low that it like looked foggy.
I think I remember looking into Gex. I did a review on Gex on Rocket Elijah early on before doing like Animal Crossing stuff, and I played the N64 version. It was a weird game. They have different voice actors based on which country you're in too, like in different English voice actors. Like they have a British voice actor and an American voice actor.
Does he have a British accent in the British version? That's kind
I think so, yeah.
That's kind of funny, dude.
So they whisked me away to Interrogation 101. They play rough. Start giving me the business. I give a little back.
So they whisked me away to Interrogation 101. They play rough. Start giving me the business. I give a little back.
Gex was a really weird, like surreal experience. I played that on original hardware when I played on the N64, and it was a weird game to play because I didn't play it as a kid. I only played it as an adult, and yeah, it's a weird game for sure.
You know, Geico should buy the rights and make a Geico Lizard game remake.
They don't even have to buy the rights. They can just make a Geico Lizard game. Like
I guess so.
We just need a Geico game. So ultimately, I think we have a pretty good list here. If we missed any, let us know in the comments down below. Maybe we'll revisit this topic in the future. Huge shout out to our patrons and our YouTube members for making videos like this possible. Also, if you want to join in while we're doing it live, like this section with viewers and reading the chat sometimes, and then, you know, like the version you're watching, we kind of cut that out. But if you want to see the full unedited thing, stop by our live streams Friday nights. Put it in your calendar on your phone, 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. But yeah, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you guys next time with another video. Bye.